This is the third video lecture covering Lesson 3 in Clayton Croy's A Primer to Biblical Greek. In this lesson, we will be concentrating on the Greek noun. In addition to providing an overview of the Greek noun, we will discuss more closely the first pattern of Greek nouns known as first declension nouns. Let's begin with an overview of the Greek noun. To begin with, it is necessary to know that Greek is an inflected language. And what that means is that grammatical relationships are indicated by the form of the word, not by word order. Let's consider some English examples so that we can understand this difference a little bit more clearly. So first, here's a sentence. The boy called the dog. And here, if we analyze this grammatically, we see the subject, the verb, and the direct object. The subject is the boy, the verb is called, and the direct object is the dog. So the one receiving the boy's call is the dog. Now if we change the word order, the sentence is entirely different. The dog called the boy. Of course, this is somewhat nonsensical, but it illustrates how important word order is in English. So here, the dog is the subject and the boy is the direct object. It's important then to realize that although the forms are identical, it's the boy and the dog in both sentences, the meaning is entirely different given the word order. But in Greek, the relationship between words, or what grammarians call syntax, is determined by their forms, and word order is much more flexible. So we're going to spend a lot of time looking at these forms and trying to recognize these forms so that we can make sense of how words relate to one another in Greek sentences. Let's provide some characteristics of the Greek noun. Each Greek noun has three important things. First, it has gender. The gender may be masculine, feminine, or neuter. And it's important to point out that gender refers in most cases to a grammatical category, not a biological category. And if you've studied another language like Spanish or French, you would be familiar with nouns or pronouns having gender as they do in Greek. The closest thing in English is gender-specific pronouns. He or she or it would be the example of masculine, feminine, and neuter, or perhaps gender-specific nouns like actress versus actor in English. Next, the next important category is number. And with Greek, you can either have a singular or a plural. And finally, case. This is really what indicates the function of a word in a sentence and its relationship to other words. And this will probably be the strangest aspect of the Greek noun for those of you who have not studied Greek before. So let's talk a little bit more about case. These are illustrative and basic examples of case, and they're not comprehensive. More nuances will be added as we move on, but these are some basic ways to think about case. So there are 5 cases in Greek. The first is the nominative case, and this is what is known as the naming case. It's simply the subject or predicate nominative. That means it's either the subject, which is the thing doing the action or having the action done to it, or it stands after a linking verb, which is a to be verb like is or become, and simply is sort of renamed after that verb. That's what we mean by predicate nominative. Then there is the genitive, and this is known as the defining case, and it's often the case of possession. Thirdly is the dative case. This is the relating case. It illustrates relationships between different words, and it often signals the indirect object, which again in English grammar, the indirect object simply means it's the object by which an action is done to somebody. So in the sentence that we looked at before, the dog called the boy, an example of the indirect object would be the boy called the dog with his voice. That prepositional phrase, with his voice, would be similar to the indirect object use of the dative case in Greek. Fourthly, the accusative case is known as the limiting case. It again is frequently going to signal the direct object, the one who is receiving the action of the verb, in other words. And finally, the vocative is the case of direct address. So let's talk now about Greek noun patterns, or what are known as declensions. There are 3 basic patterns or declensions for forming Greek nouns and other words. The first declension is the one that we are learning today. This consists largely of feminine nouns, and they tend to end in either alpha or eta. So here's a pattern of, or a chart of those endings. And you can see that the endings are either an alpha or eta. And then there are additions to that that signal the case. So a or a, as or ace, a or a, on, ain, a or a, and then the plural is I, own, ice, as, I. So you can see on the left column, these are our 5 cases: nominative, genitive, dative, accusative, and vocative. And the form changes for each of those cases and then changes again for the plural with rather than the singular, as you can see here. So let's take an example from the textbook. This is the Greek word hora, which means hour. And you can see now the endings added on to that root in this, or that stem, in the same sort of way that we saw with verbs in the last lesson. So hora, horas, hore, horan, hora, horai, horon, horais, horas, horai. So what's really important for you as we progress in this class is that you begin to memorize these endings. It's really important that you begin to do so, because we're going to be building on these basic declensions to cover different words and different forms. So please note, though, that in this case, the singular genitive and the plural accusative are identical in form. And so the only way to determine which case is in mind in an actual Greek sentence is to use the context. All right, let's look at another additional form. This is the Greek word phone, which means voice or sound. And this is a noun that ends in eta. So phone, phones, phone, phonen, phone, phonai, phonon, phonais, phonas, phonai. And so you can see here, again, that consistent pattern of a, ace, a, ain, a, I, own, ice, as, I. Let's do one final noun, which is the Greek word doxa, which means glory. And we're using this one because it's what is known as a mixed type. And so you can see that it begins with an alpha at the end with doxa, and then with doxes and doxe, it turns into an eta. And then with doxan and doxa in the accusative and vocative, it turns into an alpha again. And so, but then in the plural, it's pretty consistent. It's I, own, ice, as, I. So again, let's just briefly review these endings, because we want to pound these endings into our head for first declension nouns. So a or a, as or a or a, on, ain, a or a, I, own, ice, as, I. So some clues about this. The first is the nominative singular is what you will memorize. It's also what you will look up in a dictionary. The genitive singular that has the final signal preceded by an alpha or eta. So you might look in the genitive for the sigma at the end, but as I pointed out earlier, that might also signal to you that you're in the accusative plural, as. The genitive plural will always be own, but this is not just true of feminine nouns, it's also true of masculine and neuter nouns, which we'll learn about in a future lesson. Generally, the dative is signaled by that iota. You see it in ice, and then you see it hidden under the alpha and the eta with the iota subscript, which we talked about in a past lesson. And then finally, the accusative singular has the nu preceded by either an alpha or an eta. So that nu at the end is a signal that you're in the singular accusative case. All right, a few brief final notes before we have our first translation together. The definite article the will be introduced later. So for now, all that you need to know is that he is the definite article for feminine nouns. There are no separate words for indefinite articles, a or an, in Greek. So if you see a Greek word without a definite article in front of it, in this case the letter he or the word he, you would translate it as a or an. So you would translate it as a dog rather than the dog, unless there is the word for the definite article before it. So a few notes on translating practice and review exercises. Like I said in the last lecture, you should begin by trying to find the main verb. From there, though, you would like to find the noun that is in the nominative case. This will, in most cases, give you the subject of that verb. And from there, you would like to find the noun in the accusative case. In most cases, this will give you the direct object. And this will then allow you to get a basic sentence of subject, verb, direct object. And then after that, you want to identify other nouns and their cases and begin to figure out how they relate to one another. At least at the beginning, working through Greek sentences is going to feel like a puzzle. It's going to feel like trying to figure out how words relate to one another, and that's okay. It will get easier as we move along. A final note on parsing. Again, remember, parsing is just a fancy word for saying the analysis of a word. And so when we parse nouns, the order that we're going to follow is gender, number, case. So feminine, singular, nominative, or something like that. So let's get started with our first practice and review exercise. Ehomen basilean doxes, kai akuomen phonen aletheas. We would begin to find the main verb. And so as we look, I only see two verbs, and fortunately they're formed exactly alike. So we know that there are two main verbs, and that they are echomen and akuomen. And I've highlighted here those endings, men, to indicate the first person plural of those verbs. Next, we would like to find the nominative. Now in this case, there is no noun in the nominative case. Rather, it is implied by the verb echomen and akuomen. So we know that the subject of those verbs is we because of the form of those verbs. So we have and we hear are the verbs. Next, we want to see what the accusative is. And if we're looking at this sentence, I see two accusatives, basilean and phonen. And you can see I've marked those endings, on and ain, that we just talked about in those charts. And then we would discuss the other nouns in the sentence that need translation. And both of these are in the genitive case, doxes and aletheas. And in this case, we would most likely translate these of glory and of truth. So let's have an example of the translation. We have a kingdom of glory, and we hear a voice of truth. Let's just parse one verb and two or three of the nouns. So let's begin with the verb echomen. We would parse this as present, active, indicative, first person, plural. And the key marker for us is men at the end. Now we've already talked about basilean. So we would parse basilean as feminine, singular, accusative. And we know that based on the ending on. And finally, let's talk about aletheas. We would parse this as feminine, singular, genitive. And again, we would know that it's feminine, singular, genitive by that os ending. That's the end of this lecture on lesson 3. Thank you.